Hi, this is Pastor Clark here at Sardis Missionary Baptist Church. I want to take this time to thank you for worshiping with us via social media on Sunday during this time of COVID-19. You're always welcome to join in with us as we experience Christ, share his word, and build believers, even here during this time. Thanks again. Please feel free to join us.
Good morning, Sardis family and friends. Welcome you to our morning worship service on today. I'd like to thank you for tuning in, those of you who are watching locally via Facebook or YouTube, and also a special thank you and welcome to those of you who are watching via other parts of the world. Pastor Clark sends his greetings to you all today, and we are continually praying for him as he is getting some much needed rest. We thank God for sending him to us here at Sardis, but pastoral ministry can be draining. So he has taken some time to rejuvenate and to replenish himself. And as a church family, we are praying for him. Don't want to prolong the time this morning, but I do want to invite your attention to the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 24, beginning at verse 13. The Gospel according to Luke, chapter 24, beginning at verse 13. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. It reads as follows. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And Jesus said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all of this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that Jesus was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Verse 31. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. For a few minutes this morning, I want to talk about the invisible man. The invisible man. In 1952, Ralph Ellison, a famous American novelist and literary critic, wrote a book entitled Invisible Man. Ellison's book has become quite famous because he describes the experience of a black person living in white America. Ellison uses the metaphor of invisibility to describe the lived experience of black people facing psychological and emotional trauma because America refuses to see us. It is a painful experience to be present in a room, but no one sees you. It is a traumatic experience to be present in a world, but people refuse to see you. It is dehumanizing to be present in a country that intentionally makes you invisible, unable to acknowledge your humanity, refuse to recognize you, incapable of dignifying you. Why? Because of your blackness, or because of your race, or because of your age, or maybe because of the way you express yourself. It is certainly a painful experience to be present where people refuse to see you. In Luke chapter 4, in the text that I've read for you this morning, the disciples are in a traumatic situation. And the situation has prevented them from recognizing Jesus. Jesus appears to them, but they do not recognize him. He is physically present with them. He's walking alongside of them, but in their eyes, he is invisible. A few days prior, the disciples had witnessed the killing of Jesus, an unarmed black man, an innocent black man, a black man who loved and helped his community, a black man who was known for having a significant impact on his city. This black man named Jesus grew up in adverse circumstances. He was born into controversy because his mother became pregnant with him while she was engaged to Joseph. And since Joseph and Mary had not had any sexual intercourse, it created speculation and rumors about who was his daddy. So Jesus lived life addressing the issues of his community, speaking truth to power, confronting corrupt politicians, protesting injustice, denouncing unjust policies, eradicating systemic poverty, providing universal health care for the sick, challenging the elite who took advantage of the poor, and starting a religious movement where people were liberated from social, economic, and spiritual oppression. But unfortunately, this black man was killed. And in the words of James Cone, he was lynched. These two disciples in our text this morning had witnessed a state-sanctioned execution where people gathered, they watched, they cheered on, and championed the killing of an innocent black man. And while these two disciples were walking to a small village called Emmaus, they were talking about everything that they had witnessed. They had walked this road before, but this day was very different because it was an emotional day. What should have been a normal, joyful and joyous 7-mile walk ended up being a journey filled with anxiety, a journey filled with depression, a journey filled with fear, defeat, anger, helplessness, and rage. The text says that they were walking and engaging in an emotional conversation about how Jesus, this black man in their community, had been tragically killed at the hands of the government. Luke tells us in verse 15 that while they were talking and about these things, that Jesus himself comes along beside them and joins them on this emotional walk. And while listening to them talk about everything that had happened, Jesus simply asked them what they were talking about. And the two disciples began to explain to him everything that had happened as if he did not know. Now, the irony here, however, is that they are talking about Jesus and they are talking to Jesus himself at the same time, but they were unable to recognize him. They thought he was a stranger. They assumed he was the kind of person that lives life out of the loop. They assumed he was the kind of person who lives life detached from social reality. They spoke with him as if he had never watched the Jerusalem news. They spoke with him as if he had never read the New York Times, as if he never listened to NPR, as if he had never seen a Roland Martin show, Joy Reid, or Rachel Maddow news segment. Jesus engages them in a conversation, but they are unable to recognize him. He is invisible to them. They are looking at him, but they do not see him. They are talking to him, but they do not recognize him. They are engaging in conversation with Jesus, but they are unable to recognize that person they are talking to. They are unable to recognize that the same person to whom they are talking is Jesus. Unfortunately, these two disciples are looking at Jesus and talking to Jesus, but something is preventing them from seeing him. Isn't it amazing how people can look at you but don't see you? Isn't it amazing how people can see you but not recognize you? Isn't it amazing how people can talk to you but not embrace who you are? According to Ralph Ellison, black people in America are invisible to white people. It isn't because we are not physically present. It's not because we wear some special clothing that makes us invisible. But the reason why we are invisible is because America refuses to see us. And this is one of America's greatest sins. How is it that we can live in one of the greatest so-called Christian nations, but yet the nation refuses to acknowledge us as human? How is it that we can live in one of the richest countries in the world, but that country refuses to see us? How is it that black people have contributed to the well-being of this country? Your grandmama, your grandmama's mama, and your granddaddy built this country, sustained this country, saved this country, yet this country refuses to see us. American society has been stained with the odor of immorality because it refuses to see black people as human. Invisibility causes white America to see black people as inferior, subpar, deficient, alien, ignorant, animalistic, depraved, immoral, lost, unfit, unintelligent, incapable, othered, and disregarded. And anytime you refuse to see someone's humanity, you make them invisible. We've witnessed the continued invisibility of black people a lot over the last few years. And the last few days, we again have witnessed the invisibility of black people through the state-sanctioned killing of, for instance, Daunte Wright. Yeah, Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old black male whose mother happens to be white, was pulled over by 48-year-old Officer Kim Potter. Potter pulled Daunte over because of expired license plates. But the story ends by the former Officer Potter shooting Daunte with her gun, and she claims that she thought it was her taser. And this happens the same week as the country is seeking justice for George Floyd. How is it that black bodies are often carried away in a coroner's van because white police officers refuse to see black bodies as human? Why is it that Dylan Roof walks into a black church, kills black people while in worship, but walks out alive, put in handcuffs, and taken to Burger King for lunch? How is it that the Bundy family can organize a militia, engage in a standoff with the FBI for 41 days, and they all walk out to live to talk about it? Carol Anderson, in her book, White Rage, describes the reason for this. And Anderson argues that white America is uncomfortable with the concept of blackness. And as a result, it problematizes blackness through legislation, through our educational system, through our housing practices, and even through our voting and election procedures. It is the concept of white rage that causes white America to set up roadblocks which prevent the advancement of the black community. White rage. White rage. White rage is psychotic. It is sinful. It is a mental disorder that makes people create false beliefs and false narratives about black lives. And it causes them to lose touch with reality and act on their deeply held beliefs that black lives are commodities that need to be conquered, that black lives are commodities that need to be tamed, that black lives are commodities that need to be manhandled. America refuses to see black bodies as human because to America, black bodies are invisible. Jesus knew the disciples were unable to recognize him. He had not changed his appearance per se. He was the same person that they had always known. And although Jesus had taught his followers that he would suffer and be killed for his truth telling and be resurrected, the disciples struggled to believe him. Jesus knew the disciples believed false narratives about him, and he also knew they struggled to reconcile his death with his resurrection. So in our text, Jesus comes along beside these two disciples as they were walking on the road to Emmaus. He overhears their discussion, eases into the conversation, then probes them about the nature of their conversation. What are you talking about? And while listening to their responses, Jesus recognizes the tone in their voices. The disciples are sad. They are disappointed. They are helpless because their Messiah, Jesus, had been killed by a government-sanctioned execution. So in response, Jesus slowly begins to reveal himself. He takes the high road in the conversation. He could have pulled a power move and showed the nail prints in his hand, but he chose not to. Jesus simply reveals himself. Jesus doesn't condemn them for their unbelief. He simply reveals himself. Jesus doesn't compare them to the women who had already believed. Jesus doesn't say, look, you stupid group of men, how is it that you don't believe? But the women came to the tomb, saw the tomb was empty, saw the angels in dazzling clothes, yet they believe. But how is it that you don't believe? Jesus doesn't take that route. He simply reveals himself. After all, Jesus knew these two disciples had experienced as much emotional trauma as he had. So Jesus turns their long walk of sadness and depression into a long walk of clarity and revelation. Jesus doesn't demote them from being his disciples. Instead, he emancipates them from their inability to see. Yes, Jesus simply reveals himself. And as they walk, Jesus escorted them into understanding his purpose and mission. Jesus' revelation empowered them to see him not as a stranger, but to see him for who he was. Jesus' revelation equipped them to see that he is now the resurrected Messiah. Jesus knew they were unable to recognize him, but that did not hinder him. Jesus simply revealed himself. The man who was once invisible to them is now the same man who opens their eyes and corrects their inability to see. Jesus simply reveals himself. The resurrected Messiah brings revelation and understanding to the minds of these two disciples. And the Emmaus Road then became the place where Jesus transformed their thinking. No longer was he an invisible stranger, but he was now the greatest prophet, the greatest liberator, the greatest emancipator, but most of all, the resurrected Messiah. Jesus opened the eyes of these two disciples as he explained to them how his suffering, how his death and resurrection was orchestrated in the Torah and the prophets. Jesus emancipated these two disciples from their inability to see. He expanded their thinking by engaging in conversation. These two disciples, walking to Emmaus, began their journey unable to recognize Jesus, but ended their journey recognizing him as the resurrected Messiah. Their conversation about him changed. Jesus simply revealed himself. Does a kind of society exist where black bodies are no longer invisible? Does a kind of society exist where black bodies are not treated as a threat? Does a kind of nation exist where driving while black ceases to be a death sentence? Does a kind of world exist where white power withdraws its strategic purpose of destroying black lives? Does a kind of world exist where government-sponsored and government-sanctioned attacks on black bodies are eradicated? I want to submit to you today that the Spirit of God equips us to see black bodies as valuable in the sight of God. In fact, God does not make any mistakes. God creates all people in God's image. In fact, God placed his DNA, God's very breath, God's essence, God's the quintessential nature of God is in place inside of all human beings. And God values and sustains that which God has created. The Spirit of God releases us from the stronghold of invisibility and white supremacy. And the Spirit creates a passion within us to restore the dignity and the humanity that has been stripped away from black bodies. It nurtures a desire to build communities where fear ceases to be the guiding principle in our relationships. The Spirit of God nourishes our quest to embrace black bodies instead of denouncing them. Jesus simply reveals himself so that invisibility becomes distasteful and problematic as we live out God's core values of justice, love, and community. Jesus simply reveals himself so that the notions of a superior race is wiped away from our desires and pursuits. The Spirit of God empowers us to create a world where justice is not co-opted, where black communities are lifted up and restored and built to thrive and advance. The Spirit empowers us to create a world where black people can live without the emotional and psychological trauma of the effects of white supremacy. Jesus reveals himself. The Spirit opens our eyes so that we might look and see, so that that which is invisible because of human depravity becomes visible and be seen as created in the image of God.